Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion is under attack. And so what can we do? Appreciate those of you who are joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started.
So we'd like to start off our time together today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on, despite the fact that we're meeting in a virtual space. We start off this way to express gratitude and appreciation to those territories we are residing on, and as a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. It's important that we understand the longstanding history that has brought us here and seek to understand our place within that history, whether we came here by choice or were forcefully brought to this country. And so Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwakma, Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territory lands. It's critical that we take a moment to recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands, and the deliberate and systemic destruction of their communities and culture, which still happens today. Over 100 million Indigenous peoples were slaughtered in the Western Hemisphere over the past 500 years. Today, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous folks left in the US. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you to look up the land that you are on, educate yourself about the communities that are native to your land, share your learnings with others, and take action to support those local Indigenous communities when you can. We also now, if you'd like, invite you to honor the lands that you are zooming in from by entering their names into the chat. Fiona?
Thank you, Cassie. Hello, everyone. We are really excited to have this conversation. But first, before we dive in, we want to officially welcome each and every one of you. We welcome people of all genders. This includes people who are women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. People of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We welcome all of the languages that you might speak: Spanish, English, sign language, indigenous languages, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure where we might fall on the class spectrum. We welcome people who are currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like affordable health care, adequate housing, reliable transportation, affordable and accessible childcare, etc., and people who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, heterosexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you might experience yours, including chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who identify as activists and people who do not. We welcome the single, married, partnered, those dating in monogamous relationships or polyamorous relationships. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not. People who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome your wide range of emotions that you might bring into this space, including joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment, whatever it is, it's welcome in this space. We welcome people of different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. And finally, we welcome people who have been to sessions like these in the past and those who have not. So, from Healing Equity United to each and every one of you, we hope that you felt that your identities were specifically named and uplifted. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. I definitely feel very welcomed. I also want to say, hey, it's Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander ANHPI Heritage Month. And really this May, it's a time for us to honor the culture and histories of our communities. And it's also important for us to acknowledge the ways in which white supremacy culture has used the ANHPI community in times as a model minority, as an attempt to pit people of the global majority, BIPOC folks, against one another. And at other times, parts of our community have been scapegoated during times of war, economic downturn, disease, etc. As many of us know, there was a rise in hate crimes during COVID pandemic, and that is just the most recent spike in violence and attempted erasure of the ANHPI community. So in order for us to effectively disrupt this crisis of hate, we need to bring a broader understanding and awareness to the scope of the problem that ANHPI communities face and to uplift our stories and experiences. We hope that you will make space to have meaningful conversations with people in your network and consider the ways in which you can leverage your privilege to be in solidarity with the ANHPI community this month and every month of the year. Oh, and that's me. So hi, I'm Jess, and I go by she series pronouns. I wanted to introduce myself since I was already talking. I am currently one of the co-founders and principal consultants at Healing Equity United. And so the way that we introduce ourselves, we often tell folks more about who we are and how we show up holistically, because you can always find our professional references, and bios on our website or on LinkedIn. And so I am someone who identifies as a first generation immigrant, born in the British colony of Hong Kong. Came to the US when I was a kid with my parents who were blue collar workers in Manhattan. And I took ESL, English as a second language, in school. And as soon as I learned enough English, I became a de facto interpreter and translator for my parents. And that's still something I do to this day. Currently, I am based in Oakland, California, where I live with my partner, who identifies as a second generation cisgender man who grew up in a more wealthy area. So we have a lot of conversations about socioeconomic class. We also have a lot of conversations about language, because one of the things that I noticed after I moved out to California is that I had privilege in terms of being able to be completely fluent in Cantonese, whereas for him, being second generation, it's a language that he knows some words, but may not be able to effectively live in places like Hong Kong. We also have two dogs. Hanson, who's pictured above, is my service dog because I live with an invisible disability. And then Kobe, who is pictured at the bottom, is my pandemic puppy. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague. But as we're introducing ourselves, we also want to take this opportunity to get to know all of you a little bit better. And so if you can just put in the chat your name, where you're coming from, and anything else that you want us to know about you, that would be great. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Fiona.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, but still share some key identities that impact how I move through society and ground me in this work. I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to naturalized citizens. I really had to navigate and saw firsthand how the society puts in place barriers to immigrants, particularly those without documentation. Having said that, I'm a US citizen. There's a lot of power and privilege in that identity. And I ask myself very often how I might be in better solidarity with immigrant communities to leverage that US citizenship to be in solidarity with them. I am an attorney barred in New York and DC. And even though I don't currently practice law, I always have to be mindful of the duality of that identity. On the one hand, for some people, it grants my voice a certain amount of credibility, valued experience. People take me more seriously. On the other hand, some people think, oh my goodness, she's an attorney, that's alienating. I don't want to talk to her. I don't want to have anything to do with her. So I always have to be mindful of that identity. I'm a native New Yorker from the South Bronx. Go Yankees. And that community is primarily Black and Brown, has higher rates of poverty, substance use, criminal activity, and higher rates of love, support, resilience, all of the things that have been critical to forming who I am today. I am going to share, last but not least, that I am married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. And hey, thank you, Miriam. I see another Bronx person out there shouting me out. Um, we talk about the fact that, as an immigrant, he hasn't faced anything like the challenges everybody else in my family faced. He always thinks he has a right to be in certain spaces, and people never question him about that right. So we talk about his whiteness, his maleness, his white maleness, everything in between. We have 3 biracial children, half Black, half white, the eldest of whom identifies as a Black woman with a white father. Cassie?
Thank you, Fiona. And thank you everyone for introducing yourselves in the chat. Please continue to do so. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the senior consultant with Healing Equity United. I identify as a queer second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial, as I have a white father. I grew up in New Jersey, but when I think about home, I think of the city of Philadelphia. I'm a first-gen college student, and I started my career out as a middle school science teacher. And so I wear that educator hat in all the spaces that I occupy. I currently, though, live in Seattle, Washington. I've been out here for about 7 years now. I live with my partner and doggo, who are pictured there. My partner identifies as a Black cisgender male who's working in housing and homelessness. Jess, I'll pass it back to you.
So just to tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United. And so Fiona and I founded Healing Equity United over 5 years ago, because one of the things that we noticed as we worked in a nonprofit space for many, many years is that, as we rose up through the ranks of being in a nonprofit, starting out initially as interns, to being front desk folks, to being to working directly with survivors of domestic violence as case managers for Fiona Legal Services, to being, program managers, executive directors, and then sitting on boards. We noticed that there was this trend that, people and leadership never really looked like us, never really looked like the communities that we were serving. And yet Fiona and I were constantly called on to work with organizations who were asking us questions of, well, how do you work with immigrants? How do you work with someone who doesn't speak the same language as you, right? We were doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. As some of you shared, you're also doing this work, right? But some of us have been doing this work since even before George Floyd, right? And so 5 years ago, we came together to really shift the landscape of nonprofits, to really understand what it means to transform their cultures, to really center DEIB, which we believe is really mission-driven work. And so for us at Healing Equity United, we work one-on-one with organizations, doing equity audits. We also provide a series of workshops and training, and a lot of direct coaching, direct consulting, as well as executive coaching. So that's a little bit about Healing Equity United. But let's get to, why we are here today. And we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so before we do that, I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the group agreements. I know some of you are already sharing in the chat. We love that. And Fiona, what else should we keep in mind as we're having these discussions today?
Well, one big thing I would say is, disregarding the lure, the temptation of playing into the oppression Olympics. We operate from a space of all oppression is tied. I can't, separate the oppression I might face as a female from the oppression that I might face from being Black. They're interconnected. And so we come from a place of oppression is tied, liberation is tied. Let's not fall into the oppression Olympics. Um, and I think another one that I would pull out for today's conversation is leaning into a brave space. Lean into a brave space because, uh, quite frankly, it's going to take a lot of bravery from all of us to counter this anti-DEI wave. So those are the two that I would pull out.
Thank you, Fiona. Just a couple of webinar technical agreements. We have a Q&A section at the bottom. If you have questions that come up, please put those in there so we can keep track of them. Continue using the chat to communicate with just hosts or with everyone. And just put this in the chat earlier. The recording and slides will be sent out to everyone who registered, so know that that will be coming in your inbox after the session. And feel free to use the reactions button if you have one, just to communicate what you're thinking or feeling or agreeing with or disagreeing with as we go through our time together today. So our goals, let's dive in. We're going to explore how to push back against DEI challenges and adapt to the evolving landscape and delve into actionable strategies that we can take individually and within our organizations. And so we're going to just do a quick pulse check so that you all can let us know what you're hoping to get out of our time together today. So we're going to be using Mentimeter. So you can use your phone to communicate the answer to these questions, or we are going to drop a link in the chat and you can communicate that way. So we'd like to know what brings you here today. What are you hoping to get out of the session? And we'll give y'all a moment or two to hop onto that Mentimeter to share your thoughts. If you've never used Mentimeter before, your responses are anonymous and you could submit multiple times. And you can also vote on submissions that you agree with. So we'll give you all a moment and then we'll share screen. All right, so we see some responses coming in. And I'll read them aloud for accessibility purposes. Community and strategy, information. I'm a part of my department's DEI group and want to learn more. Curiosity and learning. Continuing to expand my learning about DEI work. Strategies to push back against anti-DEI strategies in red states. Basic knowledge about how to combat attacks on DEI. Here to feel up to speed in the field, hope to learn language and messaging to use to be a part of the solution. Practical, concrete steps to push back. Learning more about DEI attacks and what I can apply in our own organization. Mutual support, how to live in Texas. I'd like to learn more about what is happening with anti-EDI and how I can help prevent it from spreading. Solidarity and strategies for those in states like Texas and Florida. I'm distraught about how it feels we are going backwards in areas of diversity, in particular, the laws in Texas, Florida, and other states, particularly on higher ed. I want to learn how to push back. As a passionate DI practitioner, it's been challenging to not only find work in this field, but just overall belief in the work, wanting to learn more about how to combat. Love it. It looks like overall, we're looking for some support and definitely want to walk away with some strategies to be able to push back against those attacks on DEI. So let's dive in. And I will pass it over to Fiona.
Oh, thank you, Cassie. So I loved the Mentimeter feedback. So first of all, you are not alone. I really feel like it's on my spirit to share that you are not alone in this attack on DEI, having efforts to combat it, and it shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise. So why are we talking about this? Well, this is, I don't want to say all coming from, but a lot of it is coming in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision prohibiting race being specifically used as a criteria for college and university admission decisions. And although that decision was specific to race and institutions of higher education, we have seen the sort of mushroom cloud of everyone saying, oh, the Supreme Court made this decision vis-a-vis education, so we can't mention race or equity or oppression anywhere else, right? People are sort of, well, I don't want to say, some people are leaning into that explanation or excuse for no longer being called to do the work, right? We've seen a lot of DEI initiatives that promote equity for all marginalized people and marginalized identities come under attack, right? However, historically, the backlash to an increasingly diverse society and reallocation of resources and power is not new. And we always knew that this backlash was coming and should always be anticipated, right? So let's go through a little bit of this history, some historical context, and then we can dive into how it's showing up today and what we can do about it. So, and we're taking hundreds of years and overly simplifying it here, but I'll just say this, that post-enslavement, many white folks resented what they perceived to be a loss of social status, of financial power, of a power over in society. And consequently, they implemented a variety of new laws and policies and practices that would ensure that Black folks continue to stay in their place, right? Some words like don't get uppity, right? Don't forget where you belong. Stay in your place. And, it was one of the first signs of a backlash of gaining some form of liberty in one sphere, and quickly those who had different power dynamics in their social identities saying, I'm going to hold on to my power at your expense, and I'm going to push back of any change in that social dynamic, that sort of social seesaw, if you will. So Black codes were passed in states to give certain freedoms to Black folks, but primarily it limited many other aspects of Black folks' lives, like the right to vote, the right to be in certain labor spaces, to get certain jobs. And so again, we see this beginning pattern of the advancement of marginalized advancement being followed by severe backlash. Right, some historical context continued that folks of the global majority, people of the global majority, were specifically kept out of certain what you call white collar jobs, right? They were segregated and forced into manual labor jobs, domestic labor jobs, and kept out of this growing space where they could accumulate significant financial wealth and security that would lead to intergenerational wealth, right? So in the wake of that, in the 60s through the 70s, there was affirmative action. And supposedly this was a tool that would disrupt the discriminatory practices that effectively kept people of the global majority out of those white collar spaces, right? Having said that, the primary beneficiary of affirmative action has always been white women, has always been white women. I remember having a very heated debate with my constitutional law professor about this, and like having to come to class with data to prove that it wasn't about those unworthy people of color, right? Like whatever. I'm not going to go down that road because that is not what we're here to discuss. But um, since then, there have been advances in protections for folks with disabilities, folks who were queer, and surprise, surprise, cue the backlash. Jess, take it away.
And so some of you mentioned Texas and Florida. Oh, Texas and Florida. But you know what? Let's actually start with Duke, because Duke is not located in either of these states. These are just some of the recent examples of attacks on DEI. And so some of you might have heard Duke University, they ended their Reginald Howard Memorial Scholarship, which essentially covered full costs for Black scholars. And they're going to replace it with a new program that's open to all races. In Texas, a federal judge ordered that a 55-year-old US agency that specifically catered and was supporting minority-owned businesses to serve people regardless of race. And they essentially sided with white business owners who claimed that the program discriminated against them. And you know what's interesting about this ruling is that it was significant for people who identify as conservative, so conservative activists. Essentially, it was a win for them against race-conscious workplace program. And then lastly, many of you know, Florida laws prohibiting DEI programs at schools. And this is just a couple of the many examples that are out there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to show you a map of some of the states that have introduced anti-DEI bills. And what's interesting is that, you know, if you look at this, and it's color-coded by introduced, passed at least one chamber of the House or Senate, or enacted, right? This is what it looks like. And we encourage folks to keep tracking, right? Because even in states that are seen to be a little bit more progressive to a certain extent, like Massachusetts, you still have, you know, bills that are introduced. And so the interesting thing is that as attacks of DEI has continued, we see that there has been an impact of these DEI roles that people were in and were hired after the murder of George Floyd. And so we'll see that there have been DEI roles that are being you know, gotten rid of at a lot of corporations and companies. You'll see here that they're basically being eliminated. And really what we need to also think about is that the reality is that there is a business argument for DEI. And so companies that have DEI teams have generally shown that they have more diverse hires. And those with DEI type teams have higher employee ratings because people feel like it's more of an inclusive and equitable space. And that is a business argument that is being made. But the reality is that this is also affecting the nonprofit sector. And so one of the things that I like to think about is that, okay, so for corporations, and I live, you know, in near Silicon Valley, and so I've talked to folks who work in DEI roles in tech companies. And one of the things that they shared with me is that there is still an expectation in corporate company culture for folks to just adapt to the existing culture. I like to think that as nonprofits, it's a little bit different because DEI work is essentially mission-driven work. But we also know that these attacks have been affecting organizations in our sector. And so there has been a growing risk of lawsuits. And there was, some of you probably already know, it started with a recent lawsuit against the Fearless Fund, which is based in Atlanta. And their mission was essentially empowering African Americans to have access to capital. And they essentially awarded grants to business ventures by Black women. And this lawsuit was essentially brought forward by a conservative activist. Some of you might know his name, Edward Blum. And he argues that Fearless Fund's grant-making process amounts to explicit racial exclusion and is prohibited by under civil rights laws. And in the work that Healing Equity United does, we have had organizations that we work with come to us and ask us, well, what happens? What should we be worried about this? Should we be, thinking about lawyers, right? And what we're seeing more and more is that nonprofits and philanthropies, foundations are really thinking about what they need to do and what they need to have in place to lower their risk of litigation. Also recognizing that many nonprofits don't have the funds, the resources, or the abilities to actually take on those fights. And so let's talk a little bit about how we might be able to resist when DEI shows up, when attacks on DEI shows up.
Well, before we get there, Jess, I think it's important for us to talk a little bit about the ways that, especially for some of us, I saw in the chat, a number of us named were DEI practitioners. We are doing this work for our organizations, or we are consultants ourselves. And it's important for us to recognize the ways that resistance might show up internally. Yes, DEI is getting attacked externally, right? But we might have some folks on our teams that are internalizing those messages, right? And we want to talk a little bit about the ways that that might show up. So there's 3 ways this might show up. First, status threat. This is when people in power and with privilege feel that their organizational status or resources are threatened. They perceive diversity initiatives as zero-sum terms. I think I saw Aaliyah in the chat put that in earlier, right? They think, well, if we are centering these folks, then that means that I'm going to lose my power and I'm not going to have as much privilege as I do currently, right? It also might show up, the resistance might also show up as merit threat. And this is when folks use that argument that DEI initiatives imply that those folks that are being hired, that are bringing more diversity into the company, into the organization, are simply being hired not because of their achievements or skills, but because we are needing the numbers, right? It's based on their group membership as opposed to their skills or qualities. The last one is moral threat. And this is the sense that if you acknowledge your privilege, you tarnish your moral image by linking yourself to an unfair system. This especially comes up when DEI initiatives highlight how their group might have violated their own moral principle to equity, right? So this is when we think about, but we're good people. We can't be racist, right? And so some of the ways that this has shown up, I don't know, maybe some of y'all might have seen this. A couple weeks ago, there was a Google employee who wrote a memo after a DEI training arguing that gender gaps in the tech sector were not a result of discrimination, but rather non-biased causes. This memo is a classic example of defending in that it argues that existing inequities are legitimate because they are based on supposed biological differences. Some of the other ways that these threats might show up, the classic defensiveness that we see as kind of a white supremacy cultural norm. It might also look like distancing. And this is when members of an advantaged group, maybe white identifying folks within the organization, are willing to acknowledge that there's discrimination and inequality, but they themselves distance themselves from the work personally by arguing that they are not biased and they have not benefited from discrimination, right? And because they are experiencing that privilege, they're already at the top. They are like, well, I don't need to do any of this work, right? And so what can we do as organizations and individuals to combat this when it comes up? Fiona?
Thank you, Kathy. And again, I can't support the chat engagement enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Keep it going. We wanna see that. We want to create a network of us who are countering this narrative. So what can we do as organizations? The first thing is we have to really reassess an organization's understanding of how oppression, shows up in our organizations, right? Like there seems to be this massive disconnect between the theory of racial inequity and the theory of oppression and how it shows up in our organizations, as if we can't look to, disparities in salary, as if we can't look to the composition of our boards, as if we can't look to, the culturally specific organizations fighting for funding from foundations when mainstream white-led organizations have more access to those foundation funding, right? Like, so we have to really reassess how we understand the day-to-day manifestations of oppression in our organizations, and then we have to recommit to interrupting it. Now, this one is going to be a challenge for those organizations that in 2020 were real quick to put out a statement and then thought that was it, right? This is, are you all serious? And let's have an honest conversation about, are we serious to this commitment? Okay, do we want to move beyond the statement? And sorry to say, there are going to be some organizations that we're going to lose, right? Because they thought the statement was it in its entirety, right? Another part is clarifying the organization's DEI values, and then trying to make sure that we are valuing different perspectives and experiences for all groups, right? So the purpose of DEI is to really make the playing field more equitable, more level. It's not about taking away from specific groups. It's about opening more doors for more people to enhance our effectiveness and our efficiency and ultimately serve whichever populations our nonprofit organizations are supposed to be serving, or enhancing the art if it's an art related nonprofit, or like whatever it is that we're doing as nonprofits, we're supposed to be doing it better. Isn't that always the goal? And survey after survey, data after data says that increased diversity enhances output, the product, right? So we have to get more clear on why integrating DEI values into this work, as just said earlier, is the mission. It's not separate. It's not in a box. It is not something we'll get to later. It is the work. We want to highlight the win-win benefits of DEI, right? And I think that this one is particularly, I was just having a conversation with someone this morning who is the executive director of an organization. And what she was saying is she finds it more helpful with her board in particular and with funders is to frame the changes differently. So shifting to a 4-day work week as, investing in staff and building their capacity to do the work without being burnt out, right? When we know it, 4-day work weeks are about equity, about sharing more budgetary information with all managers, supervisors, and directors instead of all of that financial information being held exclusively with the executive director, right? Oh, that's about being more responsive to programmatic needs. When we all know that that's really about power sharing and equity, right? So it is, from our perspective, helping not only board members, but other leaders in our organizations in understanding that DEI and DEI efforts are a win-win. They're a win-win. And if you can sneak it through and not put the moniker of DEI on it, and then circle back later after it's been proven effective, and say, by the way, those efforts relate to DEI, and here is how. Here's how it promotes equity. Here's how it counters oppression and interrupts oppression. Another thing I think that we can do with our organizations is that we have to acknowledge that this is everyone's work. So everyone has to take on the work. It can't be one DEI professional's job. And I've said this, and I don't know if you all have heard me years ago, that many of these hires, in initial hires in 2020 for DEI professionals and the DEI practitioner was about hanging all of the burden and responsibility on one person's shoulders and then making that person the scapegoat for no change, or making that person the scapegoat when there is inevitable pushback to challenging the status quo. This can't rely on one person in the organization. It has to be everyone's work. Okay. Another one is reframe resistance to DEI with the mirrors and windows framework. So that one says, well, what are you creating so that others can see themselves represented in the spaces they're in with you, right? So it may not be, do you have more people of this ethnicity or that race or who speak that language on staff, but saying, oh, we serve this diverse community. What are we doing to make sure that they see themselves reflected in our organization and that they belong in our organization, right? How are we creating more inclusive spaces, right? How are we integrating folks with lived experiences into our work and genuinely valuing them? Before I turn it over, Cassie and Jess, did I miss anything? Because I see some engagement in the chat, but I couldn't follow it. Did I miss anything in sharing that?
No, I don't think so. I love what I see in the chat though. Let's pass it over to Jess so we can talk about what we can do as individuals.
Yeah, so oftentimes we're thinking about this as how do we approach it from an organizational perspective, and then there's also something to remember that we ourselves are individuals, right? And that we are part of the culture of an organization. And I think one of the things for us to remember is that first, we have to acknowledge that what is happening is real. I mean, I think that I speak for myself, Cassie, and Fiona, when we have days where we just something pops up in the news and we're like, seriously, did that just happen? Is that real? And I think that it's important for us to acknowledge that what is happening is real, but also remembering that we are part of a larger movement to combat anti-DEI efforts. I mean, just as I love what's happening in the chat, as you all are building community with one another, there are many of us working on this. I think the other thing to think about is that if we're talking with our colleagues or our funders, right, or our executive directors or leaders, it's important for us to keep in mind that we have to think about meeting people where they are in terms of the language that they're using and or understanding. One of the things that it has been sometimes challenging for us that have been doing this work for a long time is, when we come across folks who use words that we consider to be racist, or they talk about instances that or they ask questions about like, well, shouldn't this and this and this happen? And I think what's important for us to remember as activists, as change makers, is that not everybody in the country has, the same level of access and education that many of us do, right? So if we think about, someone who grew up in a state like Texas or Florida and didn't have access to BIPOC history, right? And not understanding what that is. And I know this unfortunately because my history textbooks were originally from Texas, even though I grew up in New York. And so really being able to call folks in and it is going to be a really important part of this process. But then also keeping that intersectionality in mind, right? And so for those of us who work with more immigrant communities, right, they may have a different perspective on these issues. And they may see themselves more in terms of ethnicity versus as one race, as we talked about earlier. this is ANHPI Heritage Month, but the reality is that even in the ANHPI diaspora is extremely wide, right? Um, call on your family, your colleagues, your friends, because those folks who are, pushing back are someone's family. They are colleagues at a workplace. They are someone's friends, right? And support nonprofits who are actually intentional about doing DEIB work, right? Who are still investing the funds, who are still pushing forward, right? Who have, we work with some organizations in DC, and some of them have been working with legal services nonprofits to be prepared for a potential lawsuit against them. And then, of course, political action, right? Know that, local decisions actually affect the national long term. And so, regardless of how we feel about the presidential elections that are coming up this year, one of the things that my partner who does on grassroots organizing work reminds me of every day is that those people started out somewhere. They started out, work like sitting on commissions or in city council, right? Or for lawyers like Fiona, they ended up being judges, right? And many of us don't actually, unfortunately, read those big thick books that come along or do a lot of research, but recognize that we have to take the time out to do that, particularly this year, because even in states like California, um, there are pushes for anti-DEI legislation. So this is not just limited to states that this is that have more activists, anti-DEI activists.
Jess, can I add one thing to just
Yes.
amplify what you were sharing about supporting nonprofits that are intentional about DEIB? We have the power to either create or support the spaces and cultures that we want to see in the world. And if there is a current organization, and I realize that a lot of this is based on privilege and ability to do so, but if your organization or your organization's leadership is committed to the status quo and abandoning their so-called commitment to equity, go actively, intentionally seek out those spaces that are committed. And we see it every day in the organizations that we're working with. They will name it in the job description. They will have it on its website, right? They will have their commitment in the board recruitment description, right? Go to those organizations. And, unfortunately, our nonprofits tend to be a bit reactive and responsive. So our funders, right? So when they see that it's impacting their ability to hire, and they start doing a little digging and figuring out, oh, that organization that's committed to culture change doesn't have a problem hiring, but we do, the change will follow. So I just wanted to amplify what you were saying, Jess. Thanks for letting me interrupt.
Thank you.
So we love the examples that have come in through the chat so far, what folks are seeing and hearing in terms of organizations and individuals combating the attacks on DEI. Please feel free to keep those coming in, and we'd love to answer any questions that y'all have. If you have a specific question that you would like us to address, please feel free to put it into the Q&A. And as we're waiting, Jess or Fiona, anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation?
One thing that I didn't mention earlier about the historical context and subsequent backlash, you can use that as a talking point to educate folks and to sort of acknowledge and validate the emotional piece that comes along with it, the fear, the disillusionment, right? And you can counter it like, we have been here before. And I saw somebody in the chat said, our elders, our ancestors who did this work and moved through it, we've been here before. So you can take some of those historical pieces and bring them to today's conversation to validate and uplift continued commitment to these issues.
Thank you, Fiona. I see we have some questions that are coming into the Q&A. Let's answer this one. How do we support success of DEI committees or DEI teams? Are committees even a place of change?
I started laughing with that one because that is I think the eternal question, right? So there are a couple of things. One, DEI committees in name only aren't going to impact anything, right? So we see DEI committees that are created that have no resources, access to resources, and have no power in terms of shifting culture, right? Um, to enhance the efficacy of a DEI committee, we have several recommendations. One, ensure that some representation from leadership is on that committee, right? Two, ensure that there is a sufficient amount of financial resources allocated to the committee to do its work. Three, the committee's work should not be in addition to your 510 other responsibilities in your job. It should be a part of your job. And so if some of your responsibilities need to shift to someone else on the team, so be it. But being a committee member is the work. Again, to Jess's point, it's mission-driven work.
Can I
Another
just
thing,
add?
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Can I just add to that, Fiona, what you said about having a leader on the committee? And so oftentimes what we say is that having the leader on the committee doesn't mean that they're okaying everything. They're actually supposed to be an ally, an accomplice, or a co-conspirator, right? And that is the role that they play. It's not necessarily to like lead the committee. Sorry, Fiona, I just wanted to add that point.
No, that absolutely, Jess. Thank you so much. They should, and as a matter of fact, I saw in the chat earlier that it was a power over instead of power with. If leadership, when leadership is on the DEI committee, it should be a power with, right? The leader should be speaking as little as possible, but only to maybe set up some, expectations. Like if the DEI committee says, we're going to buy a building and call it the DEI culture, then there's somebody in leadership who's going to say, you know what, that's probably not going to work. So let's try something else, right? But that should be it. Some other parts of the DEI committee's effectiveness is that folks on the committee should be culture carriers. They should be modeling DEIB principles in other spaces of the organization in order to educate and empower those folks to advance DEIB initiatives. There's so much more that the committee can do. I'll just leave it with one last thing, that the DEI committee should not be working in a vacuum. It should be reaching out to all other members of the organization to solicit feedback, input, and have that information inform the committee's work, and then constantly sharing iterations of the work with others outside of the committee so that it is about just spreading DEIB work so it's not on one person's shoulders. I see you laughing, Jessica. I'm being quiet now. I'm being quiet.
No, I think that's great because Fiona loves talking about DEI committee. It's actually one of the things that Healing Equity United does support with. So I'm really happy that you got that question from Natasha. I think there's one more question, a few more questions coming in, Cassie.
Yeah, I see a question here. Are there any specific legal resources for fear of lawsuits? Anything come to mind for either of you?
I'm gonna bump that over to my lawyer friend, Fiona.
Well, I know that the DC Pro Bono organization is doing some investigative work to find out how they can provide resources and support to nonprofit organizations. You may want to reach out to the pro bono entities in your jurisdiction. But there are several things that, are quite standard. And again, this is not legal advice. This is legal information, right? So your effort should not be about, we are only going to hire the ABC person. No, here are the values we have as an organization. Here's our commitment to equity. And we are looking for not only people with the skill set, but who are equally committed to these values and this commitment. Not saying that ABC person can't be hired specifically. We're not precluding them, but here's what we're looking for. That, efforts shouldn't be quote unquote mandatory, like the mandatory training, because, there's probably going to be somebody who's going to be a squeaky wheel and may reach out to a lawyer. They're highly encouraged. And then the culture of everybody around, it's like, yeah, we're going to that training. That's cool. We want to learn more about that. And those who aren't into it, well, they might say, this place isn't the space for me anymore, and go their separate ways, right? So those are just some pointers that I would share, but definitely reach out to your local pro bono organizations to get some more resources.
Thank you, Fiona. I want to be mindful of time. I think we have one more question. I'm going to share screen again so that y'all can capture our info and definitely submit some feedback on that form if you have the time. It shouldn't take too long. And as we're on our way out, Fiona, there's one more question about DEI committees. What is your view on outside stakeholders being part of the DEI committee?
That one I'm not so sure about. It depends on their understanding and commitment to equity and DEIB principles. I mean, I wouldn't want to create a space where there's someone who comes into the space only to derail all efforts. But I do believe, and we have seen examples of board members being on DEI committees with staff. Volunteers, like, those volunteers who have been there for 500 years and doing the work. Like, we've seen examples of board members, volunteers, and staff being on a DEI committee together so that they could go back to their respective spaces to advance their DEI work and action plans in the board space, in the volunteer space, and on the staff.
Thank you, Fiona. And thank you, everyone. We are at time. Thank you for being here. We'll be sending, again, a follow-up email with the recording, any resources that were named in the chat, as well as how to connect with us on LinkedIn. We also have a upcoming webinar on debriefing some of the latest Supreme Court decisions that will be coming up in June once the decisions are out. And if you're curious to attend, we'd love to see you. As always, it's donation based, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.